A lone protester standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square may be the iconic image of that time, but it is very much just a snapshot of what was going on in China in 1989. Weeks of protest demanding democratic reform, students on hunger strikes, the army opening fire and killing untold numbers among them. It was 30 years ago this month. What do we make of it today? Let's ask. David Mulroney, he is former Canadian ambassador to China and author of Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, What Canadians Need to Know About China in the 21st Century. He's now a distinguished senior fellow at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Jan Wong is here, formerly the Beijing correspondent for the Globe and Mail and author of Red China Blues, My Long March from Mao to Now. She now teaches journalism at St. Thomas University in Fredericton. Chuck Kwan, past chair of the Toronto Association for Democracy in China, and Mehmet Tohti, Canadian representative for the World Uyghur Congress. And we are delighted to welcome everybody to TVO tonight for what will no doubt be a difficult conversation about, frankly, an awful time in the history of China. Before we look back, David Mulroney, I just want to get you on something that's happening right now. In Hong Kong, hundreds of thousands of people protesting a government plan that would allow extradition to mainland China. What do you infer from all of that?
What we're seeing is the latest in a series of Chinese steps to undo all of the promises that they made when Hong Kong was established as a special administrative region. The British left in 1997. And step by step, we've seen the Chinese tinkering with Hong Kong's constitution, using very well-heeled moneyed interests in Hong Kong to undermine its democracy. But the most important thing, I think, is extradition, because it means that China's long arm can reach into Hong Kong and pluck out anyone, including Canadians or transiting Canadians, and bring them back into the PRC's own legal system. The last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, said that the whole idea was to wall off the two places, and China is now breaking down that wall. We saw a million or more people on the streets in Hong Kong protesting this, but there's every indication that its government, which is basically run by Beijing, is going to push it through.
Do you think its days, Hong Kong's days, as an autonomous part of the Chinese picture are over?
I think they've been over for some time. And there are two things. One is Beijing is just not comfortable with the fact that Hong Kong has autonomy and independence and is home to free thinkers. And two, there's a commercial side to this, that they want to dismantle Hong Kong as a potential rival to Shanghai. And both of those things are largely accomplished.
Okay. Jan, let's look back. 30 years ago, you were there. You were in Tiananmen Square. And I want to, let me first get from you your sense of how, comparing China today to then, how different is that place now?
It's like night and day. In 1989, there was so much optimism and hope and excitement that maybe China could take a different road and become democratic. And today, Tiananmen is a dead place. They have basically covered it with plainclothes police, and you can't go there, and the protests are squashed. You can't do anything, so it's night and day.
Do you ever wonder what China would be like today, 30 years later, had they not brought the tanks in 30 years ago and crushed everybody?
I think China would be a moral leader in the world. If China had taken the democratic road and coupled with its economic might, it could be the moral leader. Right now, we don't have a moral leader in the world because the U.S. is in terrible shape with Donald Trump. So the whole world history could have been completely different. It's very sad.
Chuck, do you ever think about what China would look like today, if only?
I agree with Jan. I think there was so much optimism in the air, even of those, when I was in Hong Kong during that time, the whole Hong Kong came out, 1 million people marched, just like what happened last week. This, to me, was could be a turning point in history. And now we're seeing Hong Kong, 1 million people march, taking up that torch, left behind by the students 30 years ago. And who knows where we'll end. We cannot be very pessimistic, but I still feel a bit of optimism in the air.
You feel a bit of optimism nevertheless?
A little bit.
Just that much?
Yeah.
I don't.
No, you don't see it.
1 million people, they don't care.
Mehmet, how about you? The Uyghur people are obviously suffering mightily as a result of today's China. Do you think about how things might be different had things gone differently 30 years ago?
Actually, from 1989 to 1991, that 2 years period was important for China. And not only for China, East Europe and some other countries, former Soviet bloc countries. And during that time, and because of the international tendency and some wise leaders' choice, Eastern Europe and former Soviet republics, they made different choice, and China made completely opposite choice. And so those Eastern Europe countries, they embraced the rule of law and the democracy, and it is progressing. When it comes to China, since the crackdown of Tiananmen, instead of people's voice, we can hear more and more voice of military and the tanks and the gunshots. And when we talk about the Uyghurs today, the Uyghurs example is the one that not only for some other people in the, living in autonomous region, just like Hong Kong, every Chinese citizen and member of the civilized world, they have to take very seriously, because China is using all means of high-tech surveillance and digital control and monitoring every walk of life, not only eliminating the autonomous rule of the region, the autonomous speech of individual.
I do want to remind everybody that there were weeks of demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in the lead up to when the tanks were eventually brought in. And let's just play a clip here. Sheldon, can we roll this? This is 7 years ago. This is Ezra Vogel, professor from Harvard University, who did a superb book on Deng Xiaoping. And here's what he had to say about why the tanks were brought into Tiananmen Square on the 4th of June, 1989. If you please.
He gave that order at the end of 2 months of turmoil, in which he was really frightened that China was going the path of Eastern Europe, where communist parties were falling apart, the Soviet Union was falling apart, and he felt that the only way to enforce order at that time, when so many people were demonstrating, and on May 20th of '89 had blocked the entrance of the military, who then went in unarmed to try to restore peace, and they were unsuccessful. So he felt the country was just getting too lax, and the only way to bring it back together was, as you say, sadly, by force. And he would do what was necessary, and he never regretted it.
He never regretted it. David, it was a brutal response to what he was seeing, but in light of what was going on around the world at that time, given the Chinese context, was it a reasonable response?
No, it wasn't a reasonable response, and it was a tremendous missed opportunity, because just as they were worried about what was happening in the square, they consistently misread what the students were saying. They misread their own wise advisors, like the ousted premier Zhao Ziyang, and they did things that only inflamed the students and made the continuing protests more likely. So it was, as Jan said, a tragedy of immense proportions, and it was a tremendous failure. They knew that there was ferment in the communist world. Gorbachev indeed visited Beijing, and it was tremendously embarrassing for them when that happened. But had they listened to wiser counsel, they could have benefited from the process. They didn't have to shoot the students.
All right, Jan, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. The Communist Party is still in charge in China. China has made more economic progress than maybe any other country in the world, given its size and conditions and circumstances and so on. From the point of view of the regime, this worked, didn't it?
Yes, it worked, but I don't think about things from the point of view of the regime. Mm-hmm. I think about things from the point of view of the rest of the world and of the ordinary people in China and of the people in Xinjiang. It's a disaster. Yeah, the Communist Party and the Politburo are just fine, but I agree with David. It was a big mistake, and it wasn't as if the Politburo was united on this. They were split on this, and the reason it took 2 months is because the Beijing garrison refused to move on the people of Beijing because they knew exactly what was happening. It took 2 months because Deng Xiaoping had to bring in armies from all the rest of China. He wanted blood on everyone's hands so everyone would be equally culpable. So, and Deng, I don't necessarily agree completely with Ezra Vogel. Mm-hmm. He's a great expert on China. But what he missed is that Deng Xiaoping was himself a victim of the Cultural Revolution. And Deng Xiaoping's son was defenestrated, pushed or jumped out a window, paralyzed. So Deng had a completely different attitude to protest and people. He was afraid. And he was an old man by then, and Gorbachev was relatively young. Gorbachev saw that this is not the future.
And there's no question Deng gave the order.
There's no question.
To move the tanks in.
He was the paramount leader at the time.
Because Li Peng was the premier, and he also imposed martial law just before that, right?
Yes, but Deng was the boss. And
Deng was the
we
boss.
know this now because all the documents have come out. This is not speculation, right? We know this.
Chuck, what about the people who were sent to prison back then? Do you know if any of them are still in jail 30 years later?
No, I don't think so, but I'm sure that a lot of them had languished in jail. They might have died. All we know was that the most wanted list got out. Most of them got out. Some sort of prison sentence that was let out. However, there are countless number of laborers, people, just ordinary citizens, who were arrested for the term turmoil, for the term of disturbing the peace, that they were in jail, and we never know what happened. Could be hundreds and thousands of people in jail. And nobody wants to talk about it. That's a sad part of what's happening with China right now.
Well, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. I want to stay in the time, though. Okay, we know certainly what happened in Tiananmen Square. Were there protests in other part of China at the same time that this was going on in Tiananmen Square, Mehmet, to your knowledge?
It happened because at that time I was in Kashgar and I
Where's that?
Kashgar is south part of the Uyghur Autonomous Region. It is maybe 6,000 kilometers west of China. And it is the oasis city built 2,000 years ago by Uyghurs. And so students, among Uyghur students and other ethnic people from all walks of life, they took the street. And probably the slogan and some others may be a little bit different than what the students took up in Beijing. For example, corruption was the #1 slogan. And the freedom and the democracy and the election was the main slogan among the Uyghur students, because all buses and the street walls just covered with those slogans. And tens of thousands of people took the street. And the peak point of the demonstration was May 19th. And the Chinese government still criticized and referring that part of the history is 五幺九事件, which means May 19th event in Urumqi. And many people arrested, and among those arrested, mostly are Uyghurs. And
Most of the Uyghurs arrested.
Yeah.
David, I think one of the things we maybe ought to clarify here is that the students didn't want to overthrow the government, right? They weren't trying to eliminate the Communist Party. What were they trying to do?
Well, first, what was happening was that this was the end of a decade of really exciting reform, economic reform, but also grassroots political reform. And what had happened in 1987 was one of the architects of that reform, Hu Yaobang, held a very high post, was brought low. He lost his job, and then he died in 1989. So then this is very classic in Chinese history, particularly Chinese revolutionary history. When a great person dies, people come out in the streets. So they were coming out to talk about that lost spirit of reform. But most of the reforms they were talking about were reforms that are still part of the constitution of the Communist Party of China, about consultation and due process. Since then, critics have emerged who said, well, this was, China can never be a democracy, and these are crazy ideas. They were talking about applying their own constitution and meeting some of the basic requirements for redress of grievances and things that the communists themselves had called for. So it wasn't wild-eyed, starry-eyed. These were reasonable demands.
Chuck, I do want to pick up on that element that you raised just a few moments ago, the notion that today, well, you know what, let's let the tape speak for itself. CBS News went to Tiananmen Square. They tried to show random passersby some images of the time, and here's what happened. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll it.
Just watch what happened when we showed some of the Tiananmen photos to random young Chinese passersby.
Do you recognize this picture?
No.
Is in which country?
Minutes later, the police showed up and in the end detained and held us for 6 hours.
That picture of the Seoul protester stopping that tank was the most famous picture in the world at the time, and clearly very few people there seem to know about that today. Does that surprise you at all?
No, not at all. I think Jan did the same experiment about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
She showed a tank man in Beijing University and nobody knows what it was. They were questioning whether this is a Western conspiracy. What I see is what I call generational amnesia. If you were 40 years old today, you're 10 years old at Tiananmen Square, you would never have heard of it. Because your
what?
parents will not tell you. The teachers are afraid to talk about it for fear of reprisal. So what you have is a whole generation growing up with heavy internet censorship. You cannot get WhatsApp, you cannot get Google, you cannot get Facebook in China right now. All you can do is, you're living in a world of naivete and basically clueless of what your country has done and what your country has done to the world.
So most people in China know very little or nothing about this?
That's correct, unless they're of a certain age. However, I have several things to say. First of all, that news crew should not have done that on the main street. That's ridiculous, and you're endangering people. You should go somewhere where you're not going to be spotted, and you should blur their faces. I mean, that's just irresponsible. But the second thing I want to say is, China is so advanced economically that lots of Chinese people are traveling, and they're sending their children overseas to study. So this whole idea of shutting China down, right, blocking the internet, is semi-futile, because the people are getting out, they're seeing this. And whenever you ban something, everyone wants to see it.
Sure, but given that they didn't grow up learning about this, and if they come to Western countries to go to university and they learn about it for the first time, do they believe it?
Well, that's very interesting, because I teach at a university now, and they're kind of surprised, and then they hear about it, they talk about it. They might not believe you initially, and then they start to believe it. I mean, I was there, so I can talk about it. But it's not like they've been told, don't believe this, because they haven't been told at all. You can't tell people not to believe in it unless you show it to them.
They don't know what happened in the first place.
Exactly. The Chinese government doesn't want to show it to them, so they can't inoculate them. So they come here and we show them.
Chuck referred a second ago to a trip you had at Beijing University where you showed it. Tell us about that. What happened there?
Well, I always, I just want to know what people know and they don't know. So yeah, so you show people, but I don't do it in public on the street. You don't do that. You endanger people. So you always, as a journalist, you do have to be very careful about making sure your sources don't go to jail. That's kind of fundamental.
No kidding. When did you do this?
Oh, I don't remember the specific year, but I go to China every few years.
And you showed the picture and was
I don't
there...
show the picture every
no,
year.
You talk about it.
Yeah, I talk about it. You know what? As soon as people find out, oh, you were a foreign correspondent here from 88 to 94, guess what the first question is? What did you see at Tiananmen Square? So that's all I do. I like that. That's all they want to talk about. They don't say, oh, and what did you do in 1992? No. They want to know what happened in 1989.
Do you get in trouble from your minders for doing that?
I don't have minders.
Do you get in trouble from the government? Or have you ever had difficulty trying to go back? Do they know about it?
I have trouble sometimes. And, I was almost kidnapped in the days after Tiananmen, because I think they mistook me for a Chinese. Yeah, I was almost kidnapped, and look, that's not special for correspondents. We were all being followed and tapped, and we had to be really careful not to get our sources arrested. It was just normal. I was just operating normally.
Okay, let's read something here from Dr. Christopher K. Cawley, who's an assistant professor of security studies at the National Defense College, United Arab Emirates, and he's writing this in The Diplomat. Let's bring this graphic up. The West needs to understand the social and economic realities at work in China that make this anniversary a non-event for most Chinese. We also need to question how widespread is the support for well-meaning dissidents in Chinese society at large. By placing too much emphasis on these actors and anniversaries, we may be misinterpreting and exaggerating the importance of what are now perceived by the masses to be relatively insignificant political events and individuals. More importantly, we risk missing the wider movement in Chinese civil society, which supports the Chinese Communist Party, at least as long as it increases in living standards continue. Okay, David, let's get your response to that.
Well, I think that what's true is that China has tried to, and the post-Tiananmen policy of the Chinese government has been to substitute any kind of political reform or political openness for economic growth. And so the deal is, we'll do the governing, and we will provide you with this spectacular economic growth, which has been true for 30 or more years. The economy is starting to slow, and we're seeing the inevitable result is increased repression in the Han part of China over writers and intellectuals, and heavy repression in those parts of China, in Western China with the Uyghurs, in Tibet, with Christians building churches, anyone who just can't fit into that Chinese model. So we're seeing the end of the Tiananmen consensus. The other thing I'd say is we shouldn't forget that, and I served both in Korea and in Taiwan, in both those places, massacres of young people were the actuating events, the things that kept alive a spirit of discontent and brought in democracy. In Korea, there was a massacre by paratroopers. They killed students at Gwangju in 1980. In Taiwan, it was even earlier, in 1947, the 228 Institute, where the nationalists fired on ordinary Taiwanese. So China is aware that this is a grave crime in any society. And if it's allowed to be kept alive in people's memories, it will come in to undermine the regime that perpetrated it.
Chuck, what's your view of this notion here that we may be doing a disservice to Chinese by harping on these anniversaries as much as we do?
I totally disagree with that. I think we have to conquer amnesia. Milan Kundera once said that the struggle of people against power is a struggle of memory against forgetting. And that's something that I think the whole world needs to know. We cannot forget about what happened. And I want to go back to that clip where Wogo talked about turmoil. He was using the same word that the People's Daily editorial said on April 26. And that's buying into the game of what the Chinese are saying. They're characterizing the whole thing as turmoil, hence we can send the tanks in. When in fact, the consensus nowadays is that April 27, the day when 1 million people came out to support the students in Beijing and elsewhere, and especially in Beijing, was the day that, to quote Mao, the day the Chinese people stood up. That's what the scholars are now talking about, that day as the watershed moment of Chinese history. And it's so unfortunate that the Chinese government did not ride the wave and go into a modern China, perhaps a much better superpower than what they're doing right now.
Mehmet, your view on this tendency by Westerners to focus on the anniversaries?
Yeah, I simply call it appeasement on the name of engagement. And that is the phrase we can use most of the Western policy on China since 1991. In the name of engagement and the bilateral trade and the dialogue, and the Chinese government used all of those as a appreciation of the West, regardless what the Chinese government is doing. And that is the approach adopted most of the Western countries. It is not new. And sometimes the name changes. Sometimes it is called engagement. Sometimes constructive dialogue. And all of those approach actually put the human rights and the fundamental the issues on the sideline. Exactly what this gentleman is talking about. And instead of focusing on the real issue and the fundamental issue, just move forward and forget whatever happened. That is another way of interpreting it.
Jan, how useful is it for us to focus on these anniversaries?
Well, I don't think it's a particularly Western thing to focus on anniversaries. The communist Chinese focus on anniversaries. So to call it, oh, this is a Western obsession, is just a cheap shot.
Well, they don't focus on this anniversary.
No, they don't, and they don't want you to. And we need to focus on it because so many people died, and it was such a pivotal moment in Chinese history, and they can't focus on it. So really, it's our responsibility as a country with freedom of speech and freedom of the press, never to forget what happened at Tiananmen, because so many people died, and we don't even know how many died because the government is suppressing that information.
In fact, the Foreign Affairs Minister for Canada, Chrystia Freeland, issued a statement commemorating the anniversary, David, and she asked Beijing to account for the dead and the missing. What did you think about the advisability of putting that statement out?
Well, when I looked at the statement, on first reading, it's impressive and full marks for honesty, but it's basically a recycled statement that we've made in previous years. And that sends a message in diplomacy. They parse every word. And if you get the same message that was sent by the Conservatives in 2015, you take from that Canada doesn't want to put this as a burning issue. What disappointed me in this, and Mehmet and I have talked about it, is that there was a failure to talk about, on the 30th anniversary, the legacy of Tiananmen. Because what we're seeing in Xinjiang with this massive repression against Uyghurs and this incredibly devious use of technology is the precise legacy of Tiananmen. Using force, coercion, hiding the truth, and getting away with it. And that's what happened at Tiananmen, and we're seeing it on much even starker terms now.
If you were advising the minister on putting out a statement on the anniversary of Tiananmen, what would have been in the statement that wasn't in the one that was sent out?
I would have addressed specifically what's happening in Xinjiang. It's the largest human rights abuse on the world, on the planet right now, and it needs to be addressed. And it's a direct legacy, and we missed an opportunity. The Americans did address it. The Chinese got very, very mad, but it got a lot of attention, and it got people thinking.
Mehmet, what would you like to have seen in the statement that wasn't there?
Yeah, as I totally agree with David. And when we have a tough time with the China and the Canada-China relationship, and when we have a number of Canadians abducted by Chinese government without any due process. And instead of the recycling all the rhetoric of statement, we have to come up with something new. And what is new? And more than 3 million Uyghurs in concentration camp. That is exactly what the Pentagon report says, released 2 weeks ago. And especially Canadian citizens of Uyghur origin. For example, in my example, I don't have any contact with my mother and 37 of my extended relatives since 2.5 years. I don't know if my mother died or living. Just if there's something happened to my family members, there's no way to know for me because simple text messaging or a phone calling, everything is banned. And what Chinese government is doing for Uyghur region is it is reprogramming of human mind and re-engineering the whole population by locking up in millions in concentration camps, separating the families, separating the children, and forcing them to denounce their ethnic and religious affinity. Instead, forcing them to worship President Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thoughts, and using high-tech surveillance. So this is the human disaster is taking place, and the largest incarceration since Second World War. As David said, this is the legacy of Tiananmen Square. If you do not address properly, and what we used to say never happen again is happening, and our minister should take up this issue.
Well, I wonder, Jen, if the minister didn't take up the issue as forcefully in this year's statement because they're holding 2 of our people there right now, and she doesn't want to exacerbate that.
Right. So Canada's China policy is a complete mess right now because we are still kind of operating in the old attitude like, let's engage, let's mention human rights, but not too harshly. And this time is over. We're in a completely new era now. The gloves are off, and I think we have to be very blunt. We should have talked about Xinjiang and what's happening to the Uyghurs, because we're not getting anywhere with not mentioning the Uyghurs. We may as well at least get the moral high ground of speaking. I know we're a small country, but we need to speak up. Our China policy has to change.
Chuck, what's your view on that?
My advice to Freeland would be not only to mention Uyghur, but the fact is that I think Justin Trudeau or somebody similar cabinet level should be making a trip there, whether they like it or not. I think knocking on the door shows our moral leadership. I say, we knock on the door, we're going to see you. We talk about our Canadians captured. We're talking about our moral high ground. Let them refuse you. Let the world see that they don't want to meet with Justin Trudeau or Chrystia Freeland. Let them see that. I think I agree with Jan completely. This whole thing started with Team Canada during the Chrétien days. We were so kind of, nice and quiet Canadians. We can make a lot of trade deals. That day is over. I think we need to stand up.
David, the suggestion by former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney of sending former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien over there to knock on the door, as Chuck says. Good idea? Bad idea?
I think it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea because what we're doing is dignifying and normalizing the state-sponsored kidnapping of 2 Canadians. We wouldn't do this with any other country. And sending a former prime minister is, it's almost as if we're going back into Chinese history where people would be sent to kowtow before the emperor. What we need is tough talk and straight talk from all Canadians, including the Prime Minister. We know what the Chinese want. They want the release of Madame Meng Wanzhou. So there's no mystery in terms of what would be talked about, and we know that so far we've said we're standing up for rule of law, and she's got her day in court, and that's how this is going to be handled. But to suggest something else is to give the Chinese the hope, they're always looking for this, that if they keep shaking the tree, some fruit is going to fall. And we've got to be crystal clear that's not happening.
Should we fudge on this holding of the Huawei CEO in order to...
You mean let her go? You mean pretend that her ankle bracelet wasn't working and
fudge.
go to the airport?
Fudge.
Well, I do, but I don't work for the government. I think we should never have stopped her in the first place. Could we not just be incompetent when she's changing planes in the Vancouver airport? This is a huge... And it shows me that in our government, we didn't have the China experts. We should never have touched her. Do you know who she is? It's just like a hornet's nest for us. But now, as David says, we're a country of rule of law, and I don't know if that ankle bracelet could be like turned off. It's just a mess.
Yeah. What would you like to see happen at this stage of the game?
I agree with David, and I remember in 2007 or 8, and our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper sent the John Quetian to China when Chinese government arrested and sentenced our Canadian citizen Hussein Jilal for life. It didn't bring any result.
So no point in sending Quetian?
No point, because instead of changing our policy and repeating the same old rhetoric, as Chuck said, just playing an ice boy game, it does not bring anything. So Canada should learn to surprise China at least once. So our policy, our repeated policy is exactly what the Chinese government want us to do. And the Chinese government knows that if we continue to press Canada, Canada will kowtow us. And Canada's trying to do that. So we have to change our policy. As I said, if any country in the world incarcerate more than 3 million people, what we will do? And Canada should stand up. And our parliament did not issue a single resolution yet to condemning it. And the Prime Minister's office did not issue any public statement yet. That tough thing to do for 3 million people. And plus there is great impact on Canadian citizens, more than 1,000, 2,000 Canadians. They're living in this country as a citizen without communicating with their parents, without knowing their whereabouts.
Yeah. Can we say that we wish you well, in particular, in getting some resolution of the story that you're facing right now with the rest of your family members? We wish you well on that front, and I want to thank everybody for coming into TVO tonight and having this conversation 30 years after Tiananmen Square. David Mulrooney, Chuck Kwan, Mehmet Tohti, Jan Wong. Great to have all of you here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.